Hello, everyone. My name is Aman Bhardwaj, and I'm a Master's of Social Work student. And this is a project that I have developed for Moving Forward Family Services as part of my practicum that is through the University of British Columbia in the Okanagan. This project is centered on intergenerational trauma and mental health in South Asian Indo-Canadian families. In particular, this project will focus on the subjects of mental health, anxiety, depression, counseling, and intergenerational trauma in the context of these families or communities. There are numerous struggles that South Asian Indo-Canadian families face, which continue to permeate the culture to this day, and I will be shedding some light on that through this presentation. My hope is that future interns or practicum students of Moving Forward will be able to use this material as a frame of reference when working with the clients who may identify with this particular culture. Before I begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So let me just skip to the next one here. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx people on which we are privileged to be learning, working, and organizing today as uninvited guests or settlers. It is worth noting that I originally come from Abbotsford, BC myself in the lower mainland, which is the home of the Stolo Nation. And I also acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest there. My reasoning behind introducing my own city is due to the fact that I had the opportunity to visit a museum on Truth and Reconciliation Day back in September of last year, where it was encouraged that we should do land acknowledgements based on where we are and where we originally come from, regardless of whether we pronounce it wrong. As long as we try to acknowledge or mention the respective territories, then that is considered better than saying nothing at all. So we can go to the next slide here, which is just about providing a bit of a background and personal experiences as well. So I think the best way to provide a background is to examine the origins of where we as Indo-Canadians come from. So though I was born and raised in BC, my mother and their parents originate from a state in India known as Punjab. I just want to provide some context to how mental health is viewed and handled in India. Of course, it's safe to suggest that at this point, that suicidal thoughts or suicide itself is linked to poor mental health. According to a study on suicide prevention in India, suicide rates are extremely high, as both India and China make up approximately 54% of the global total of suicides. The authors of this particular study, who I just cited that statistic of, they also state that services related to suicide prevention and mental health lag behind general medical services in India. To add to this, there are certain barriers to suicide prevention that exist, such as lack of funds, lack of mental health professionals, stigma, cultural perspectives, and religion. Another key point is that the ratio of mental health professionals to populations is significantly low, as there are not enough professionals in this field to serve the population of India. The reason why I bring all this up is to suggest that mental health is clearly not given enough importance or prioritized enough due to the long-standing stigma attached to it, as well as the cultural and religious perspectives surrounding the topic of mental health. These, of course, present a series of issues as people in India immigrate to Canada and they subsequently bring their beliefs and thoughts about mental health as well as their traditions and values with them, just like my mother and their parents did, which I will talk about shortly. So to continue on, I would like to transition into my own personal experiences. On the subject of cultural and religious perspectives, my mother's side of the family was embedded within this culture and religion and its practices when they were in India. And this was, of course, over a period of many years. When my mother and their parents immigrated to Canada in the early 80s, they brought their cultural values, views, and outlook on life with them as they started a new life here and tried to navigate an entirely new and different world in this country. Subsequently, though they were able to establish lives of their own here over time, they were unable to adapt or change with the times as they held on to their beliefs and values from back home in India. Unfortunately, this had an adverse effect on the family unit as a whole, though I do not blame them for that in any way. This was also the case for all of my mother's siblings and their families as well. So naturally, growing up, my siblings and even some of my cousins, as well as myself, we all struggled quite a bit as we were having to abide by the principles, values, and beliefs of our culture, while also trying to adapt to the Western culture here in Canada. I cannot speak for my siblings, but I can say for myself that it was more difficult to develop my identity as I was exposed to two different ways of doing things. As well, my brother and I were taught through our culture and through our uncles that men are supposed to be strong at all times, and that showing emotions or feelings or not working hard enough were poor or weak traits, which subsequently led to us then suppressing our emotions and trying to, I guess, power through the daily pressures of life. There was also the issue of something known as parentification, as firstly, my older brother had to take over the majority of the responsibilities or parental roles in our family at an early age due to the pressures my mother was facing at the time and the lack of resources my mother had to provide for the family as we were growing up in a single parent household. I had to assume this role at some point in my life as well, the role of parentification. And again, this was not my mother's fault in any way, as these were simply the circumstances at the time and what we were expected to do as quote unquote men. Constantly suppressing our feelings, dealing with life's pressures on our own, and always having to maintain certain standards in every aspect of our lives proved to be overwhelming at times, with no proper outlets to express our frustrations or feelings. I'm 29 years old now, and just a bit of background on myself. I've struggled with anxiety since I was in middle school, though I did not realize that I actually had anxiety until much later on, only because I didn't know how to identify what I was feeling or what I was going through. My response was simply to suppress it as much as possible, because again, I just felt that it was this unknown feeling that I could not describe, and due to the limited amount of knowledge that I had about mental health, anxiety, counseling, and so on and so forth, I just felt it was better to suppress it and keep it moving, so to speak. To make matters worse, in our culture, concepts such as anxiety, mental health, depression, and counseling are looked down upon due to the stigma attached to these terms. Therefore, seeking counseling during that period of time was a completely far-fetched idea, and it was something that I thought I would never do, as initially I believed it would be emasculating, which of course is incorrect, and it was just a result of the beliefs I was embedded with based on the environment and culture I grew up in. So what happens is that because of these unaddressed issues of properly dealing with emotions or events and not speaking about feelings, a lot of trauma is then suppressed, which is what my mother, uncles, aunts, and my grandparents all went through, which of course led to that trauma being passed down through each generation. My siblings and I are only just beginning to unlearn or shed the maladaptive or outdated beliefs we have held for some time now. This is why I have been using self-reflection as a tool to question my beliefs and shed any biases I may have had from the past. This is a good segue into the next set of slides, which are based on something called genograms. So through my Master's of Social Work program, I had the opportunity to take a course on family therapy, where one of the assignments involved constructing something known as a genogram, which is just a visual representation of your family tree and family dynamics. Constructing this genogram was a time-consuming process, as I have a large extended family and there are a number of issues, conflicts, and intergenerational trauma that exist in them, exist in the family, so to speak, which I included. After I had finished constructing this genogram of my family, what happened afterwards was a very profound, eye-opening, and transformative experience, as I finally got to see with my own eyes an accurate visual representation of my family and family dynamics. I realized right then just how deep-rooted many of the issues in our family were, and I realized how intergenerational trauma had impacted certain members of the family, including myself. This led to a period of critical self-reflection where I had to process past events, feelings, and emotions, while also realizing that I would have to do quite a bit of work on myself as far as personal development goes. Now I would like to show you a regular genogram that is relatively normal with its fair share of issues and conflicts, as of course no family is perfect. Then I'll show you another genogram that I had developed for my family therapy course, which was centered on the fictional Tenenbaum family based on a film called The Royal Tenenbaums, which is a rather interesting film on family dynamics, and it's definitely worth a watch. So as you can see here on this slide, this is a typical and a relatively normal genogram of a regular family with bits of conflict here and there as shown by the red lines that you can see. The green lines are indicative of positive or strong relationships. The circles are women and the squares are men. You can see how every square and circle is linked in some way, which makes up a family tree of sorts. Now I want you to take a look at the genogram I developed on my own of the Tenenbaum family through the use of the Wondershare app. I will leave it here for a moment just for you to observe it, and I would like you to know any immediate differences that you may notice just right away. So what you may have noticed are the excessive use of the red lines in the genogram, as well as the red X's and so on and so forth. There is also the green lines there as well, as I mentioned earlier. So now if you look at this legend that I developed here of the genogram that you just saw, you will notice that there are relationships that have been cut off, relationships that are manipulative and controlling, and some relationships that are now hostile or filled with hatred. There's quite a bit of conflict and trauma within this Tenenbaum family, as shown by this genogram and even explained even further in the film. These forms of trauma may pass down from generation to generation, and within the context of the film, they impact the mental health of almost all the family members that are shown in the genogram. So this is why counseling is so incredibly important, because it would help alleviate the issues that families and communities in the Indo-Canadian culture face, while simultaneously opening up the dialogue about anxiety, depression, mental health, or intergenerational trauma. So now let's move on to a discussion about the impacts of COVID-19 on mental health and just on families as well. So there is a podcast centered on mental health in the context of the pandemic that offers a few insights into how South Asian, Indo-Canadian families and communities fared during this difficult period of time. The link or reference for this podcast will be at the end of this presentation, should you feel the need to access it. In this podcast episode, Satwinder Bains, who is an associate professor and director of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley, and Maneet Chahal, co-founder of Soch Mental Health, they discussed the reverberations of the pandemic on mental health, anxiety, depression, and addiction in South Asian communities. In particular, Maneet Chahal mentions how the issues mentioned earlier were brought to the forefront and were exacerbated as a result of COVID, perhaps due to isolation and a lack of outlets because of the restrictions at the time. It is also mentioned that according to Stats Canada, South Asians struggled with the lowest levels of mental health as compared to other Canadians during the period of COVID. Satwinder Bains also echoes the sentiments I made earlier in this presentation, in that even the immigrants of today bring their own traditions, beliefs, and ways of dealing with certain situations to Canada. They will often try to engage in preserving themselves and their families by not letting anyone know that there may be underlying issues of mental health in their families, mainly because their identity or reputation would then be ruined in society. Perhaps the most significant takeaway, though, from this podcast episode is when Satwinder Bains mentions that in South Asian communities, the family is sacrosanct. This means that in our culture, the family is always prioritized above everything else, at the expense of addressing or talking about mental health or getting the help that one needs, such as counseling services. Because there's this belief that the individual can simply rely on their family for support instead. Other topics of discussion were about the high levels of guilt and shame, which are a result of the stigma surrounding mental health, and how that subsequently influences one to suppress what they're feeling and not seek out the help they may need out of the fear of being judged. So moving on to just counseling services as well as concluding thoughts. To go back to the podcast again, there are certain approaches or changes to services that we as a community would benefit from. In the context of social work, Satwinder Bains talks about the importance of having cross-cultural competency and having advanced, well-developed skills in this area. Furthermore, Maneet Chahal mentions the importance of advocacy, advocating for cultural and linguistic mental health services and supports. She brings up the importance of bringing in these supports as early as possible by saying that all this needs to start in schools, and also to make it mandatory in schools to have courses and training videos in the curriculum that are geared towards mental health, labeling it as mental health first aid. Finally, in a social work or counseling session, more push could be made towards establishing brave spaces for our communities, which will in turn hopefully contribute to establishing dialogue that is centered on honesty and courage while challenging beliefs and maintaining respect for one another simultaneously. Implementing a brave space will help a counselor and a client interact authentically with one another. Finally, I would like to add that in the context of my practicum placement with Moving Forward Family Services, I personally feel that adopting an interdisciplinary approach when working with clients from these families or communities would be the most effective way of addressing any mental health issues they may have. This, of course, means combining cognitive behavioral therapy, healthy relationships, mindfulness, or other therapeutic approaches to help these clients achieve the results they desire, as the issues within these communities and families are quite complex and layered. Multiple approaches would be needed to help clients unlearn the thoughts and behaviors they have grown up adhering to over a period of many years. So, of course, I would want everyone to recognize that these changes would not happen overnight. I hope that you found this presentation to be a helpful and informative one, and I hope that it provides you, the viewer, with at least some skills or tools if you ever find yourself working with South Asian Indo-Canadian clients or populations. And finally, here are the references that I used. So just the one about the brave spaces there, the one on the genogram, the one on the parentification aspect, the one on the studies and mental health in India and suicide prevention, and the one on the podcast, and then finally the app that I used to develop those genograms. So thank you so much for watching and listening. Take care.